Good morning. We are now entering into the 10th lecture, and the topic of discussion is going to be research approaches. How research is approached. Because after all, research is a procedure, it's a process, something for which strategies and steps are required. So, what do we mean by the research approach? The research approach is the procedure by the researcher to collect, analyze, and interpret the data. So, how this procedure is approached? To collect the data, to analyze the data, and to interpret the data is called the research approach. Of course, we are going to discuss this research approach now. Basically, we have two kinds of research approaches. One is the quantitative approach and the another is the qualitative approach. And of course, in some of the researches, both approaches are combined, which is called the mixed approach. So, we shall be discussing these approaches to research. For the first, we discuss the quantitative approach. What is that? This approach involves the generation of data in quantitative form, which can be subjected to rigorous quantitative analysis in a formal and rigid fashion. In this approach, there is collection and analysis of numerical data to describe, explain, predict, or control phenomena of interest. So, the approach where the data which is generated is quantitative is the quantitative approach. If we are studying the impact of fertilizer on productivity in agriculture, it will have to have the quantitative approach. If we are studying the relation between income and consumption, then we are going to have the quantitative approach. because the data which is generated would be quantitative only. And if we are going to study the relation between FDI and the foreign exchange rates, then also it is quantitative approach, because the data generated of all the variables are going to be of quantitative kind. Again, if suppose we are working on the impact of MDM, that is midday meal, on the attendance of children in the school, then also it is a quantitative study, because the data generated would be generated only in quantitative terms. So, we can have so many examples. The India's trade with United States of America, or India's trade with China, or India's trade with the Arab countries, or with Gulf Cooperation Council countries. If we are studying this, then it is a kind of quantitative approach, because the data which is going to be generated for all the variables, or the data which is going to be collected for all the variables is going to be in only quantitative terms. So, the quantitative approach implies that the data generated is quantitative. However, this approach, that is quantitative approach, has been classified into further subclassification, and this approach is subclassified into first inferential approach, second experimental approach, and third simulation approach. We are going to discuss all these one by one. So, first, the inferential approach. The purpose of the inferential approach is to form a database, to infer characteristics or relationships of population. This usually means survey research, where a sample of population is studied to determine its characteristics, and it is then inferred that the population studied has the same characteristics. So, this inferential approach, the many times, rather most of the time, the population is large, or the subjects whom we have to study is large. Then we cannot go for a census or studying each individual or each members of this study individually and separately, because then it would not be, the study would not be completed. So if it is so, then what is to be done? A representative sample is made of the population, and then the sample is studied, and the conclusions drawn from the study of the sample are generalized for whole of the population. So that is called the inferential approach. Suppose we are working to study the performance of, say, government public commercial banks. Commercial banks which are owned by the government. So if we are going to study, then there are more than 20 commercial banks which are owned by the government, and they have thousands and thousands of branches all over India, sometime abroad also. So is it possible to study all the banks and all the branches and gather data from them and then put to analysis for the result? It would take our whole life, and still it would not be completed. So it would require unimaginable level of finance and human resource. So if it is so, then what could be done? If it is so, then the rescue is that a sample of these banks and their branches is made. So there will be sampling, which we will know what is that, multi-stage sampling, for selecting the banks, for selecting the cities and branches, and then a sample which is representative of the commercial banks would be made. And now the sample will be studied. The data gathered from the sample would be put to processing, put to analyzing, and then after that the results that have been gained by the or acquired by the study on the sample is to be generalized for all the commercial banks. That is called the inferential. Or suppose we want to study the performance of private commercial banks, then also there are so many commercial banks and they are spread all over the country. Some of them are abroad also. But if again we want to study the level of performance of this these private banks, commercial banks, then we have to again make a sample of these banks, and again there would be selection of some banks, cities, branches, states. There would be multi-level of sampling, and then a sample would be made, and this the data which is generated or gathered, collected from these samples would be generalized for whole of the population, that is for all the private commercial banks, and that way we are inferring the results obtained or the conclusions obtained from a sample of the population for whole of the population. This is how an inferential approach takes place. Or suppose if we have to study the say primary education or the performance of primary schools in a state, in a big state like Uttar Pradesh, then how it is to be done? There will be lakhs of government primary schools in Uttar Pradesh. So, if somebody wants to find the performance and status of the primary schools in Uttar Pradesh, then what he has to do? Again, he has to make a sample of those schools. The sample should be taken from different districts, taken from different tehsils, taken from different blocks, and taken from different villages. And this sample would be made in such a way that the sample is representative of the population. That is, the sample that we have made of the primary schools in UP does represent fully and properly the primary schools in Uttar Pradesh. Now what is to be done? The results or the conclusions that come out of this sample is again generalized for whole of the population. That is the results that we have obtained by studying say 1000 schools from all over the UP, spread all over the UP, would be generalized for all or lakhs of schools, primary schools in Uttar Pradesh. So, this research approach makes it easy for us to study the phenomenon or the subject which are very large, because if it was not so, then there would be problem and the study would not have been possible, because it would have attracted very unbearable size of expenditure, and also, and this is why inferential approach is very popular approach. Or suppose if we want to study the Indian expatriate workers in GCC countries, they are very important for the country because they are sending many billions of dollars as remittances to the country. So if we want to study them, they are about 9 million. So how it is possible to collect the data from each of these 9 million people? That is simply impossible. So how we are going to study? Again, we are going to make a representative sample of these workers who are Indian workers who are working say in Gulf countries, and by studying that sample, whatever conclusion is found, whatever the results are found, they have to be generalized, they have to be accepted for whole of the population, that is India's 9 million, about 9 million expatriate workers in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. So we can imagine the utility of this approach. Because of this approach, we can study a very large size of the population of the phenomena or problem which have very large size of the members or the population, and this approach makes it easy for us. That is the inferential approach, in which the problem is studied through sample. There cannot be, it is not possible to study all of the phenomenon, all elements of the phenomenon. So a representative sample is to be made of the phenomenon, and then these findings, these conclusions are generalized for all of the population. That is the inferential approach. I am sure I have been able to make it clear. The next is the experimental approach, of course, which is part of the quantitative approach. This approach is characterized by greater control over the research environment, and in this approach some variables are manipulated to observe their effect on other variables. That is, for the experimental approach, the control is must. So, for example, if we are studying the impact of fertilizer on the productivity of the, say, wheat or any commodity, then the it is not only fertilizer that is going to have an impact on the productivity. There are other factors also, variables also. The quality of seed, the quality of land, quality of irrigation. These are the variables which have to be kept in control, and there are ways and means how to control in the due course of the subject. Somewhere we will be discussing it. So, to study the impact of fertilizer on the productivity, the other variables like the quality of seed, quality of land, and quality of, say, irrigation, they are kept under control. And this results in providing the pure effect of fertilizer on the productivity. That is what control is. In medical sciences also, if suppose somebody has claimed to invent a medicine for diabetes, so this has to be come by the experimental approach. What is that? The patients, there would be some patients who would be the control group, whereas there would be another patients whom we would like to call the experimental group. In the control group, the normal medicine would be given, whereas in the experimental group, a special medicine would be given along with the normal. And the difference which is now coming would be certainly due to the new medicine. That is called the experimental approach, where the researcher controls other variables to study the impact of one variable on the dependent variable. In social sciences also, this is now being increasingly adopted. If we have to study the impact of a special coaching, then again we have to make one control group and another experimental group. In the control group of students would be given the normal coaching, whereas the experimental group would be given a special coaching along with the normal coaching, and by studying the data generated from this experiment, the impact of a special coaching on the success rate of students at the competitive examination can be studied. That is the experimental approach, which is not only very much popular or very much prevalent in science medicine, but this is also being increasingly applied to the social science also. Then we come to the third quantitative approach, that is the simulation approach. This approach is concerned with the construction of an artificial environment within which relevant information and data can be generated. This permits the observation of the dynamic behavior of a system under controlled conditions. In this approach, computer software is used to create models of real-world systems, processes, or events. These models can be used to test hypotheses, gain a better understanding of a system, and investigate outcomes. The simulation models can also be used to test theories about how a system works. This approach is also utilized to compare and evaluate new statistical methods. The simulation approach can also be useful in building models for understanding future conditions. So, the simulation approach is the third quantitative approach, and in this the artificial environment is created and a research is done in that. So, if suppose they do want to work on the, or say any of researches, say impact of fertilizer on productivity or any other topic. So, what they create artificial environment, and this data is generated from those artificial environments, and then this data is analyzed. That is the simulation approach. Suppose somebody is working on the strength of the bunds to save from flood. One is the experimental approach, that he builds the bunds and then he forces the water through different velocities to see the impact of the velocity of water on the bund. that is the practical approach. But suppose the same issue or problem is studied on the laptop or desktop, creating an artificial band in the laptop or the desktop, and of course then studying the impact of various speeds of water flowing with various speed and velocity, then and then the data generated is the data from the simulation approach, and then the result is found. So the simulation approach is getting popular because of the ease of working and because of the very low level of finance that is involved in this. These was the quantitative approaches and which we discussed, the three types of the quantitative approaches. Now we discuss the qualitative approach. The qualitative approach to research is concerned with subjective assessment of attitudes, opinions and behavior. Research in such a situation is a function of researchers' insights and impressions. The data generated is non-quantitative rather than qualitative. Non-quantitative form or in the form of which are not subject to rigorous quantitative analysis. Generally, the techniques of focus group interviews, projective techniques and depth interviews are used. So, in qualitative approach, the data is qualitative. So, again giving the example of satisfaction level of students from teaching in the class. Here, the data which is generated is going to be qualitative. It is not going to be quantitative. It is going to be qualitative. The student would be either very satisfied, indifferent, or dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. His satisfaction or dissatisfaction moving through a range of choices, through a range of options. So, we get the data in the qualitative form. So, if the data is in the qualitative form, then it is a qualitative approach. So, the basic difference between the quantitative approach and the qualitative approach is that in the quantitative approach, from whichever whether it is the inferential or the experimental or the simulation, in all those quantitative approaches, the data generated is going to be quantitative, whereas in qualitative approach, the data that is going to be generated is to be qualitative, and this is why this is called the qualitative approach. There are subjects which cannot be done through the quantitative approaches, which are bound to be done by the qualitative approaches, where there are phenomena, there are subjects, there are problems in which the quantitative data cannot be generated. So, the researcher has to accept or go through his research, and perform his research through the qualitative approach. And then finally, there are some researchers which adopt the mixed approach, meaning that they adopt both these. They have to do a mixed study through mixed approach. Mixed approach is a research study that combines qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis in one study. This approach can help researchers gain a more comprehensive knowledge and understanding of their research questions by drawing on the strengths of both methods. So, it is the mixed approach takes again the both quantitative and the qualitative approaches together. However, in all the problems we cannot do that. For example, if we are working on, say, how does voter and non-voter beliefs about democracy, it is a qualitative variable, help explain election turnout patterns, which is quantitative variable in Kuwait. Then here we have to go through the mixed approach. Or if we have to study to what extent the frequency of traffic accidents, which is a quantitative variable, reflect motorcyclist perception of road safety, which is again a qualitative variable in, say, New Delhi. So, here we have to go through the mixed approach because we have both the quantitative variable and the qualitative variable. Or suppose if we have to study a problem that how do a student perceptions of their school environment, that is perception of school environment is a qualitative variable where relate to differences in test scores, which is a quantitative variable. Test scores is a quantitative variable. So, if we want to relate the perception of the school environment with the difference in test scores, one is qualitative variable, another is quantitative variable. So, if we want to do this kind of study, then we have to adopt the mixed research approach. I think I should stop now, but I wish I have been able to clear what is the research approaches. Thank you very much.